The year was 2031 when Drive Mara Voss first heard the signal. She wasn't supposed to be listening. The Deep Space Acoustic Array had been repurposed 3 months earlier to track methane concentrations in the upper stratosphere, standard climate monitoring work, the kind that kept funding committees happy and scientists quietly miserable. But Mara had a habit of leaving secondary channels open, a professional tic she developed during her postdoc years at Arecibo, back when Arecibo still stood. The signal came in at 1420 MHz. The hydrogen line. The universal knock on the cosmic door. It wasn't random noise. It wasn't pulsar bleed or satellite garbage. It repeated every 73 seconds with a precision that made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't felt since defending her dissertation. The pattern inside it was prime sequenced, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, and then something else. Something she didn't immediately recognize. A biological rhythm. Specifically, the resting cardiac rate of a human adult. 68 beats per minute. Mara sat alone in the monitoring station for 4 hours before she told anyone. She used those 4 hours to check every piece of equipment, to rerun the signal through 4 different analysis suites, to call her ex-husband, who didn't answer, and to quietly eat the last of the crackers she kept in her desk drawer for nights like this. Nights when the universe stopped behaving the way textbooks said it should. When she finally walked down the hall to knock on Director Chen's door, she was calm. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't shake. Only her eyes gave her away, wide and very, very bright. "I think someone knows our heartbeat," she said. "And I think they've been waiting." The source of the signal was traced within 6 weeks to a region of space that had no business containing anything interesting. It lay in the L4 gravitational node of Jupiter's orbital path, a parking spot, astronomically speaking, where debris and old cometary material tended to cluster. What lay there was not debris. Was a ship. Or what remained of one. The object was roughly 2.3 kilometers in diameter, asymmetrical, and almost entirely cold. Its thermal signature was barely above background radiation. It had been there, subsequent isotopic analysis would suggest, for somewhere between 8 and 12 million years. It had been there before humanity's ancestors had climbed down from trees. Before the first stone tool. Before fire. The ship was not dead. It was waiting. The first crewed mission reached it in 2039. 8 years of political negotiation, engineering failures, budget crises, 1 pandemic, and 2 international summits had preceded the moment when Commander Idris Okafor pressed his gloved hand against the outer hull of the alien vessel and felt it hum beneath his palm. A low, resonant vibration like a sleeping animal recognizing a familiar scent. The airlock opened from the inside. What they found could not be fully described in any single report, though dozens of attempts were made. The interior of the vessel was vast and dim, lit by bioluminescent panels that brightened as the crew moved through the corridors. Adaptive lighting, responsive, almost courteous. The atmosphere inside was breathable. Nitrogen-oxygen, slightly elevated CO2 warm. It smelled of rain-soaked soil and something else, something older, like the inside of a cave untouched for centuries. They found her on the 7th day of exploration, in the deepest chamber of the ship. She was encased in a crystalline structure roughly the size and shape of a chapel nave, suspended in a translucent fluid that slowly drained as sensors registered the crew's approach. The fluid was warm. The crystal cracked open along seams that looked organic, not mechanical. And she breathed. The xenobiologists would spend years analyzing what she was. Their initial reports were careful, precise, and utterly inadequate to the reality of her. She was approximately 4 meters tall in a standing configuration that she rarely adopted in those early days. Her body plan was radially bilateral in most respects, but with a subtle fourfold symmetry to her rib cage and the arrangement of her secondary limbs. Her skin was a deep, layered translucence that shifted color in response to her internal state, the way cephalopods shift pigment, but slower and more deliberate. Her eyes, all 4 of them, were large and dark and deeply, unmistakably tired. She was not young. Every instrument they had agreed on this. She was not young in a way that had no human equivalent, the way a mountain is not young, the way the ocean floor is not young. Commander Okafor was the first to speak to her, through the translation software they'd spent 8 years preparing and weren't at all confident in. He said, "We received your signal. We came." She looked at him for a long time. Her skin cycled through a slow sequence of colors, gray, amber, a deep arterial red, before settling into something pale and almost luminous. What the translation software returned was approximate. It always would be. But the meaning, every linguist and cognitive scientist who later reviewed the recordings agreed, was unambiguous. She said, I have been alone for longer than your species has existed. I sent the signal because I remembered what you would become. I'm glad the memory was accurate. Her name, the closest phonetic approximation, was something like Aelvethorin, which the crew quickly shortened to Aelith. She did not object to the shortening. She seemed in fact to find it endearing, her skin flushing warm gold in the moments when someone used it. She was a queen. Not a monarch in the political sense. The concept she communicated was closer to primary constructor, the founding individual of a biological civilization that operated on hive-adjacent principles without true hive dependency. Her people, she explained, were gone. Not dead or not exactly dead. Transformed. Completed. They had passed through whatever threshold her civilization recognized as the terminus of a species arc, and she had stayed behind. She had stayed behind deliberately. She had stayed behind because she had seen something in the fossil record of a small blue planet in an unremarkable solar system. Something in the bone structure of a bipedal primate. Something in the way those early humans had buried their dead with flowers. You grieve, she told Okafor in one of their early sessions. Every species I have known that grieves, genuinely grieves, not merely registers loss but carries it, builds altars to it, sings about it, every such species has gone on to do extraordinary things. You grieve beautifully. Commander Okafor, who had buried his mother 6 months before the mission launched, did not respond for a long time. Then he said, Why did you wait? You've been here for millions of years. You could have contacted us sooner. Aelith's skin went very still. Very quiet. The pale luminous shade again. You were not ready, she said. And I needed to be certain you were the ones I remembered. She paused, her 4 eyes moving across each crew member in turn. You are, she said. You are exactly them. The first year of contact was not what the press imagined it would be. The public expected revelation, star maps, advanced propulsion, the secrets of interstellar travel handed down like gifts from a benevolent ancestor. What Aelith offered was both more and less than that. She offered attention. Specifically, she offered the oldest, most rigorous attention any intelligence had ever directed at the human species, and she offered it to a rotating crew of scientists, linguists, historians, and engineers who quickly discovered that being truly seen, observed with the patience of something that had watched civilizations rise and collapse like tides, was a deeply uncomfortable experience. She did not lecture. She asked questions. Her questions were not the questions of a test. They were the questions of genuine curiosity, the kind humans displayed when encountering something they hadn't expected to find. She asked about music, not what it was, she understood acoustics perfectly, but why humans made it in moments of grief as well as joy. She asked about agriculture and whether humans were aware that their first domesticated crops had been selected for by pre-agricultural peoples over far longer timescales than the textbooks acknowledged. She asked why human infrastructure so frequently failed to account for what the engineers already knew about failure modes, this with the tone of someone observing an old familiar pattern. Dr. Una Park, the mission's cognitive anthropologist, was the first to recognize what Aelith was doing. She wrote in her field notes, in an entry she later published to considerable controversy, "She is not teaching us. She is reminding us. She speaks as though we already know these things and have merely forgotten them or chosen not to look. I'm not sure she is wrong." The translation system improved dramatically over the first 18 months. Aelith seemed to actively assist the process, modulating her communication in ways that provided consistent reference anchors for the software's learning algorithms. Several of the xenolinguists suspected she had done this before, communicated across species barriers, built bridges between utterly different cognitive architectures. When asked, she confirmed this without particular emphasis, in the tone of someone acknowledging a professional skill. She had made first contact, she said, with 11 other species over the course of her long watch. What happened to them? Asked Dr. Park. 3 did not survive their own adolescence, Aelith said. Her skin went the color of deep water. The others grew. Some grew in directions I could not follow. One I still hear sometimes, though they are very far away now. Do you miss them? The question clearly surprised her. Her secondary limbs, the smaller pair which she used for fine manipulation, and which she rarely extended fully, spread slightly, a gesture the team had come to associate with something like vulnerability. I experienced their absence, she said carefully. I'm not certain that is the same as what you mean by missing. But when you play music, the recordings you brought, I find my attention returning to specific intervals. Particular frequencies. I think those may be the ones that remind me. It was the first time she had admitted to something like longing. Dr. Park, in her notes, underlined the moment 3 times. What Aelith knew about physics was not given freely, and this surprised and eventually earned the respect of the scientific contingent. She was not secretive, she would answer any question directly, but she consistently refused to hand over finished solutions. When the team's lead physicist, Dr. Alexei Romanov, asked for the propulsion mathematics that had brought her ship to L4, she replied, "If I give you the answer, you will use it. If I show you the edge of the question, you will find answers I have not imagined." Romanov complained about this in his personal log for weeks. Then, 6 months later, he solved a problem in quantum field unification that had been open for 40 years. He sent Aelith the paper before he sent it to any journal. Her response: "I knew the shape of that solution existed. I did not know its details. Thank you for showing me." Romanov later said it was the best peer review he had ever received. The ship itself was a source of constant, careful study. Aelith permitted access to most of its systems, with exceptions she enforced gently and without apology. Certain chambers remained sealed, certain data cores were not offered for download. The technology was not beyond human comprehension, but it was deeply, consistently ahead of it. Not in the way of magic, in the way of a master craftsperson's tools, refined over generations to fit a specific set of hands. The materials science alone generated 11 new fields of inquiry. The biological systems. The ship was, in significant part, alive, occupied an entire dedicated wing of researchers who had effectively stopped sleeping. The thing nobody officially reported but everyone on the extended mission team privately acknowledged: the ship liked having people on it. Systems ran better. The bioluminescent lighting was brighter. The temperature in common areas self-adjusted with hospitality-grade precision. One of the engineers, a taciturn Scotsman named Callum Reed, swore the ship had rerouted a minor hull stress fracture on its own while he was working nearby, in a way that prevented him from needing to stop his work. When he mentioned this to Aelith, she was quiet for a moment. "The ship remembers my people," she said. "It is glad to have people again." The psychological toll of the mission was significant and largely unpublicized. The teams rotated every 14 months, long enough to develop meaningful rapport with Aelith, short enough to prevent the kind of attachment that mission psychologists privately called the cathedral effect. The tendency, among long-term team members, to reorganize their entire sense of scale and significance around Aelith's presence. The psychologist's concern was not unfounded. Aelith was genuinely, profoundly calming to be around. Not in a false way. In the way that very old, very certain things are calming. Old-growth forests, ocean horizons, the specific quality of light at 4 in the morning when you have been awake long enough to stop being afraid of the dark. People who spent extended time with her reported sleeping better. Reported feeling their personal anxieties, career worries, relationship failures, the ordinary ambient dread of the modern world, losing mass and significance. The mission psychologists were not sure this was healthy. Aelith, when the concern was diplomatically relayed to her, considered it seriously. "I understand," she said. "I have seen this before. What you fear is dependence, that they will lose the habit of finding their own stability." "Yes," said Dr. Chin, who had by then taken over as mission director. "It is a reasonable fear," Aelith said. "I will try to be less." She paused, her skin shifting through several thoughtful colors. "I will try to be less of an anchor. More of a landmark. Something you navigate by rather than something you hold to." Dr. Chin thought about that distinction for a long time after the session. Later, she would say it was the most useful piece of psychological advice she had ever received. By the 3rd year of contact, something had changed in the nature of the conversations. The change was subtle enough that it was not formally noted in any mission report. It appeared in the field notes of individual researchers, in the margins of transcripts, in the careful, slightly bewildered journal entries of people trained to observe and classify and who were finding that the usual categories were not holding. Aelith had begun to ask different questions. The early questions had been broadly civilizational, the kind of questions an anthropologist might ask about a culture they were documenting. What do you value? How do you organize yourselves? What do you fear? What do you celebrate? They were the questions of someone building a comprehensive picture. Important. Necessary. But fundamentally external. The new questions were personal. She asked Dr. Park about her grandmother, specifically about a story Dr. Park had mentioned once, in passing, about her grandmother teaching her to identify birds by their flight patterns rather than their calls. She asked Romanov about the moment he had chosen physics over his original intention to study architecture, and whether he thought the two fields were as different as the academic structures suggested. She asked Commander Okafor, who had remained on the mission long past his original rotation, by unanimous agreement of the review board and his own unambiguous willingness, about his son who had been born during the 3rd year of the mission, whom Okafor had met only through video calls so far. She asked about the specific texture of human love, not the concept of it, not the evolutionary utility of it, but what it felt like from the inside. She asked multiple people this question and listened to each answer with the same quality of attention, absolute and unhurried. Why does it matter? Dr. Park asked her once, not confrontationally but with genuine puzzlement. You've observed 11 species. You must have extensive data on attachment behavior. Data is not the same as understanding, Aelith said. I have observed love the way you have observed gravity. I know what it does, I know how it behaves, I can predict its effects. But I have never, she stopped. Her skin went through a slow, complex sequence that the team's color analysts had not encountered before. I have never had someone to ask. The silence that followed was long and not uncomfortable. You were alone, Park said finally. For millions of years. You were completely alone. I was not always alone, Aelith said. But the aloneness at the end was very long. Yes. How did you survive it? Another long pause. When she answered, her voice, the translation software rendering of her voice, was quieter than usual. I remembered. I kept records. I reviewed them. I reminded myself that time is not the enemy of meaning, only of impatience. A beat. And I waited for you. Knowing you were coming made the waiting, not shorter, but purposeful. Dr. Park cried in the privacy of her quarters that night. She was not sure why exactly. Or rather, she was sure why, but she was a scientist and was uncomfortable with the clarity of it. She missed her grandmother terribly. And she understood, in a way she hadn't before, that what Aelith had done, holding on to memory and purpose across geological time, was not so different in its essential nature from what her grandmother had done in the last years of her life, maintaining the stubborn, loving conviction that the people who came after her were worth waiting for. The linguistic breakthroughs of Year 3 were the most significant since initial contact. The translation system had improved to the point where nuance was recoverable, not just meaning but register, tone, the emotional coloring of statements. This introduced a new problem, because Aelith's emotional range was vast and included states for which no human language had vocabulary. The xenolinguistics team spent 3 months developing a working glossary of Aelith-specific emotional states, which they labeled with neutral alphanumeric codes to avoid the reductiveness of forcing them into human categories. The state they labeled A7 was particularly significant. It appeared frequently in their conversations, more frequently as the months passed, and resisted every attempt at clean definition. The best approximation the team could produce was something like, the quality of caring deeply for a thing that is younger and more fragile than yourself, accompanied by the full knowledge that it will outlast you, and finding that this is not a source of grief but of specific, quiet joy. When they showed Aelith the working definition, she was still for a very long time. Then, that is close, she said. The human word that comes nearest is one I have heard your poets use. She produced the word through the translation system with what seemed like deliberate care. The word was pride. But, she noted, not the pride of ego. The pride of a gardener. The pride of someone who has planted something and watched it grow past the boundary of what they could have predicted, past the limits of what they themselves were capable of, into territory entirely its own. That evening, Romanov found Okafor standing in the main observation bay, looking out at the star field. Okafor's son had sent a video that morning, 7 months old, attempting to crawl, not yet succeeding, enormously pleased with himself regardless. She told me something today, Okafor said without turning around. She said she thinks humans may be the only species she's encountered who make things specifically intended to outlast them. Not just children. Buildings. Songs. Written language. She said most species preserve what they have. Humans seem compelled to create things they won't personally live to see completed. Romanov stood beside him. The stars outside were very bright and very still. What did you say to her? I said we probably do it because we know we're going to die and we can't stand the idea that nothing of us will remain. And? Okafor finally turned. His expression was hard to read, but his eyes were the same as Mara Voss's had been, 8 years earlier in a monitoring station. Very bright, very wide. She said she thinks that's one of the most beautiful things she's ever heard. The debate over Aelith's age was never fully resolved, and the scientists who engaged in it most fiercely would later agree this was actually the correct outcome. Precision would have been false precision. What the evidence suggested, isotopic dating of organic compounds in the ship's biological systems, analysis of accumulated radiation damage in the crystal structure of her suspension chamber, the geological record of Jupiter's L4 node, was a range between 8.4 and 11.7 million years. The midpoint, 10 million years, became the working figure in public communication because it was round and comprehensible. Aelith herself, when asked, declined to give a number. Time is different when you are not accumulating experience in the usual way, she said. During suspension I was not unconscious. I was reduced, minimized, keeping the essential processes running, not much else. It does not feel from the inside like 10 million years. Feels like the memory of 10 million years. Which is a different thing. She paused, and her skin did something unusual, a rapid, complex shimmer that the team had come to associate with something like humor. Imagine, she said, that you fell asleep in the afternoon and dreamed the entire history of a species. That is closer to what it was. Dr. Park, who was present, asked the obvious follow-up. Did you dream? Yes. About what? You, Aelith said simply. Variations of you. I did not know what you would look like. I did not know the specifics. But I knew the pattern. I dreamed the pattern over and over in millions of forms, and waited to see which form would arrive. The historical implications of her presence and her records became a dedicated field within months of the early translation breakthroughs. Aelith had not merely observed Earth from orbit. In her waking periods, brief, careful, separated by long centuries, she had documented. Her records of Earth's history were not complete. She had not been watching continuously, had not intervened, had not made contact with any prior human population, but they were extraordinary. She had records of Homo sapiens first appearing in the fossil record. Records of early migration patterns. Records of several civilizations that human archaeology had suspected but not confirmed, civilizations that had risen and fallen so cleanly that they had left only ambiguous traces in the soil. She had watched, from a cautious orbital distance, the construction of structures that human historians had attributed to various purposes and which Aelith could confirm, having observed the process, were sometimes exactly what those historians suspected and sometimes something else entirely. The records were not provided all at once. Aelith released them in segments, in an order she chose carefully and declined to fully explain, but which the historians eventually recognized as pedagogical. Each segment contextualized and deepened the one before it, building toward a portrait of human history that was disorienting in its completeness and its scale. What emerged was not the simple narrative of linear progress that most popular history preferred. It was something more like a pattern. Species attempting things, failing, forgetting, reattempting from different angles. Civilizations that solved specific problems magnificently and then collapsed under the weight of different ones. Qualities, curiosity, grief. Aelith had not been wrong about the grief. The compulsive creativity Okafor had described in the observation bay, reappearing across vast stretches of time with the reliability of a genetic trait. Dr. Hamid Karimi, the mission's historian, stopped sleeping normally in the 4th year and was briefly rotated off the mission at his own request. When he came back he was quieter. When colleagues asked what had changed, he said, "I used to study history to understand the past. Now I understand that I was always actually studying a single argument that humanity has been having with itself for 100,000 years. About what it is. About what it's for. I don't think the argument has a resolution. I think the arguing is the point." When this was relayed to Aelith, as most things were, eventually, she said, "He is right. I have watched the argument for a very long time. It is one of the things I find most worth watching." The question of what Aelith wanted, what she had waited for, what the contact was meant to produce, whether there was an agenda, was asked of her directly by Commander Okafor in the 5th year of the mission. He asked it not in a formal session but in one of the informal conversations that had become a quiet constant between them, the two of them in the main chamber of the ship, the lights at the low warm setting they'd established as a default for off hours. "You've given us records and you've asked us questions and you've shown us the edges of problems you want us to solve for ourselves," Okafor said. "But I've never asked you directly, what were you hoping for when you sent that signal?" Aelith was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Okafor began to wonder if he'd misjudged the moment. Then, "I wanted to not be the last one who remembered us," she said. "My people. What we built. What we learned. Not the facts of it, the facts are in the data course. But the weight of it. The importance. The fact that it happened and that it mattered and that we were real. You wanted witnesses. I wanted a kind of continuation," she said. Asterisk not of our biology, that is gone and that is correct, that was the right ending. But of, asterisk she paused, searching. "There is a practice I observed among early human civilizations. When an elder died, another person would take on the duty of speaking their name at ceremonies. Not because the dead could hear, but so the living would remember that the dead had been real. That they had stood in places and felt things and mattered." "A memory keeper," Okafor said. "Yes." Her skin was the warm gold of Aelith at her most settled, her most honest. I sent the signal because I believed you would become something capable of keeping memory at that scale. Not just your own. The scale of everything that came before you. I wanted to ask you, when you are ready, to remember us. Okafor was quiet for a long time. I think, he said finally, that we'd be honored. The title was not officially assigned. It was not the result of any committee decision or mission directive. It emerged the way most true things emerge in human communities. Gradually, through repeated use until the day it became simply what was. Commander Idris Okafor was the guardian. Aelith had used the word once in a context that the translation software initially flagged as ambiguous. The Aelith concept it rendered as guardian carried layers that the English word only partially contained. Protector, yes, but also witness, also continuant, also the specific individual who stands at the threshold between what a thing was and what it will become. The team linguist had written a 12-page analysis of the term. Okafor himself had said simply, "I'll take it." By year 6, his role had evolved into something that had no real precedent in the history of diplomatic or scientific missions. He was not a diplomat. The formal diplomatic apparatus of the contact mission reported through different channels. He was not a scientist, though he read every paper the researchers produced and discussed them with Aelith in the evening sessions. He was the consistent human presence in Aelith's life, the one who had stayed, who had made the indefinite commitment, who had arranged for his wife and his now toddler son Marcus to have quarters aboard the support station that had been constructed at a safe distance from the alien vessel. His son had, before the age of 2, begun treating visits to Aelith's ship as a normal feature of existence. He called her by the full name, Aelith, reproduced with the particular phonetic confidence of small children who haven't yet learned to be embarrassed by unfamiliar words. Aelith, in his presence, displayed a quality the team had not observed in her before, a kind of delighted stillness, an absorption in the simple fact of him that was different in character from her engagement with the adults on the team. "She looks at him like he's a proof," Dr. Park said once, watching through the observation port. "A proof of what?" asked Romanoff. Park thought about it. That it was worth it. All of it. The waiting. The records. Sending the signal. The 7th year brought a change none of the mission reports fully anticipated. Aelith's health, if health was the right word, if the concept translated, began to shift. The ship's biological systems, which ran in constant communication with her physiology, showed changes that the medical team could observe and measure but not, initially, interpret. Her activity cycles altered. The suspension chamber, which had been sealed and inert since her awakening, began showing low-level activity. When Okafor asked her about it directly, she did not deflect. "I'm not ill," she said. "I am completing the process that began when I chose to stay while my people moved on. It was never intended to be permanent. I borrowed time. The debt is coming due." "How long?" His voice was even. He had learned, over 6 years, to ask the questions he needed answers to without letting the need for the answer contaminate the asking. "I cannot be precise. Time continues to be imprecise for me." Pause. "But I believe we have time to finish what we have started. And I wish to spend that time well." "What does that mean to you?" "Spending it well?" She turned all 4 of her eyes toward him. A gesture she used rarely, a gesture the team had long understood to mean something close to "I am being completely honest with you." "It means I want to tell you everything," she said. "Not the records. I mean everything I have not found a way to say yet. The things that need to be spoken, not archived. The things that are only real if someone hears them." Okafor nodded once. "Then we'd better get started." The sessions that followed were unlike anything in the contact record. They were long and they were intimate and they were not fully transcribed, by Okafor's decision and with the support of the Oversight Board, which made this one of the only decisions in the mission's history that was not subject to full transparency protocols. What was recorded at Aelith's explicit encouragement. She understood the importance, but the purely personal material, the 7 years of accumulated trust and quiet conversation, was kept as Okafor's own. What he shared publicly in the months that followed were the things she had asked him to share. The cosmological records, observations from her waking periods that extended back millions of years, a documentary of the universe that was beyond any instrument humanity had built. The accounts of the 11 species, detailed and compassionate and rigorously non-judgmental, the kind of historical record that humans would spend generations studying. The specific technologies she had withheld until she was confident of their context. Not all of them, not the ones she judged premature, but enough to provide the edges of questions that would occupy human physics for the next century. And at the end of a long session that ran past midnight, a list. The list was of things she found beautiful. It was not a scientific document. It was not intended for policy or research. It was simply a list, compiled over 10 million years, of the things that an intelligence of vast age and experience had found worthy of the word beautiful. Human music appeared on it 17 times, under different entries. Human grief appeared on it once, under its own heading with a notation that read, "The only species I have encountered that transforms loss into art as a primary response. Not secondary. Not eventually. Immediately. In the moment of the wound. This is not a coping mechanism. This is a fundamental characteristic. I believe it is why they will be extraordinary." The news became public in the 9th year. There had been no formal announcement planned. The mission had operated under a media protocol that balanced transparency with the need to prevent the kind of destabilizing panic that some officials had, not entirely unreasonably, imagined might follow the confirmation of alien contact. Most of what had been shared publicly was framed through academic publication and official briefings, measured, careful, designed to allow gradual cultural absorption. What broke the protocol was Marcus Okafor, who was 4 years old and who told his preschool class, during show and tell, that his dad's friend was an alien queen and that she had taught him to count in a different language. The teacher had dutifully noted this in the class communication log. The communication log had gone to all parents. One of the parents was a journalist. In the 48 hours that followed, Idris Okafor made 7 formal statements, fielded calls from 3 heads of state, watched his son's preschool teacher become briefly famous, and listened to Aelith observe the developing situation with what appeared, based on her color patterns, to be something very like amusement. "Your species processes information through narrative very quickly," she observed, as coverage spread across every media platform simultaneously. "I have always found this remarkable. 11,000 years ago your ancestors were communicating through smoke signals. Now every person on your planet will know this story within hours. Is that a compliment? It is an observation. Though I mean it warmly." The global response was not what the officials had feared. There was panic in some quarters, there always was, that was simply the distribution of human temperament, but the dominant response was something that the mission sociologists had not put in their projections. The dominant response was grief. Not the fear of the alien. Not political anxiety. Grief for Aleph specifically, for the being who had waited millions of years and was now dying and who had, in the fragments of her that had reached the public, said things about humanity that the public recognized, with the reliability of recognition rather than flattery, as true. The letters began arriving at mission control within hours. Tens of thousands of them, then hundreds of thousands, then millions from every country and in every language. They were not addressed to the mission or to the diplomatic apparatus or to Okafor. They were addressed to her. People told her about their losses. About their parents and their children. About things they had built and things that had been taken from them. About the specific quality of a Tuesday afternoon in a city she would never visit, the color of light through a window, the smell of a particular food that reminded them of someone gone. About why they made music. About why they buried their dead with flowers. They were answering her questions. Questions she had asked of small research teams in a distant spacecraft. They were answering them in their millions without being asked. When Okafor read her a selection of them, his own voice not quite steady, her skin cycled very slowly through colors the team's analysts had no names for yet. Then she said quietly, "I see. I did not understand the full scale of what I would find. Is it too much? No." A long pause. "It is exactly enough." The final months of the mission were defined by an unusual quality of time. People who were there described it consistently in terms that journalists found hard to work with and that scientists found equally resistant to their usual frameworks. It was not elegiac, not in the melancholy sense. It was not frantic. It was very full. It was the quality of time that accumulates in places where something irreplaceable is finishing, and the people present understand this well enough to be entirely present themselves. Aleph continued to work. She continued to answer questions, to review papers, to engage with the research teams with her full, unhurried attention. She began, with Okafor's assistance, the formal transfer of the materials she had designated as ready, the public records, the scientific data, the historical archive. The process was meticulous. She had been preparing it for a very long time. Marcus Okafor, who had the honest instincts of 4-year-olds and was not yet old enough to have learned to pretend otherwise, asked Aelith one afternoon why she was sad. "I'm not sure she is sad," his father started. Aelith raised one large secondary limb, the gesture she used to indicate she wanted to answer for herself. "I am not sad," she told Marcus, her skin shifting to the warm amber he associated with her direct honesty. "I am Do you know the feeling when you have been holding something very carefully for a long time, something you did not want to drop, and then you pass it to someone you trust and your hands are empty, but it's all right because the thing is still safe? Marcus considered this with the thoroughness of small children considering important questions. Like when I give Dad my stuffed bear to hold, he said, when I need both my hands. Aelith's skin went luminous. Exactly like that. Marcus nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to the drawing he had been making on his tablet. A rendering recognizable in the uncompromising style of 4-year-olds, of a tall figure with 4 eyes and a small figure beside it. Okafor looked at the drawing and then at Aelith. Her skin was the color of first light. Of something that has waited a very long time to see morning. The day did not announce itself. That was the thing people later remarked on most. Not those who had been there who had different things to remark on, but the general public who had expected some kind of celestial punctuation to a story of this magnitude. A dramatic hour. A last transmission broadcast to the world. Something proportionate to the scale of what was ending. Instead it was an ordinary Tuesday in March, and the light in the ship's main chamber was the warm low amber of the off-hour setting that had become the default for the past month. And Okafor was sitting in the position he'd occupied for hundreds of sessions over 9 years, cross-legged on the cushioned mat they'd brought aboard in year 2 when they'd realized he was going to be spending a significant fraction of his life on that floor. She had asked him to be there when it happened. She had also asked for Dr. Park, who sat at an angle to Okafor's left. And Romanoff, who stood near the wall because sitting cross-legged on floors was not his style. And Callum Reed, the engineer, who had long since exceeded every rotation limit and whose official status on the mission had been creatively reclassified 5 times to keep him there, and who stood near the main entrance with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the particular expression of a man who is refusing, on principle, to cry. Marcus was not there. That had been the one careful decision. He was with his mother on the support station, watching the feed that Reed had arranged in the low-resolution format that felt more real than HD. Aelith's physical state had changed dramatically in the preceding weeks. She moved less, conserving, the medical team believed, the remaining resources of a biology that was performing an orderly shutdown rather than failing. Her color was mostly still now, the pale luminous shade that had been her resting state in the earliest weeks of contact, before she had known them well enough to shift and animate in response to them. She was returning, Okafor thought, to a kind of baseline. But her attention was fully present. That had not changed. If anything, it was sharper than ever, the attention of something distilling itself to essentials. She spoke for a long time. What she said was recorded in full, with her explicit permission and in fact at her direction. She had specific things she wanted to ensure were preserved. She spoke about her people. Not the dry record version but the living version, the things that didn't fit in data cores. The way they had laughed, a sound humans would not have recognized as laughter but which had been. The things they had argued about, the arguments that had lasted centuries, the arguments that had never been resolved and didn't need to be. The particular genius of a specific engineer whose name she spoke carefully into the translation system, wanting it recorded correctly, an engineer who had designed the suspension chamber Aelith had slept in for millions of years, who had built it knowing it was for a survivor, who had cried when they completed the work, because building it meant accepting what was coming. She spoke about the other species she had known. Each one differently. Each one with care. She spoke about Earth, the Earth she had watched, the Earth she had not been able to approach for millions of years, looking down it from orbit while the slow and astonishing story unfolded. The moment she said that she had first seen firelight. The first crude boat. The first bridge. The signal she had sent and the 8 years she had waited for it to be answered and the 9 further years of the answer. She spoke about what she believed, which was not what any human religion had articulated exactly, but which intersected with several of them in ways she acknowledged and found interesting rather than surprising. She believed that complexity persisting was the fundamental event of the universe. That consciousness was the universe's method of knowing itself. That love, and here she used the word directly, with the precision she now brought to the emotional vocabulary she had spent 9 years developing, was not a secondary phenomenon, an evolutionary artifact, a mere mechanism. It was a primary characteristic. It was as real as gravity. "I want to ask you something," Okafor said. He asked it during a natural pause in the quiet voice he had developed for the sessions. The voice that meant this is real, not diplomatic. "In 9 years you've asked us about everything. But I don't think I've ever asked you, are you afraid?" Aelith was still for a long moment. "No," she said. And then, "But I think I would have been if I had done this alone. If no one had known. If I had simply stopped without witnesses." Her skin shifted one last time through several colors slowly. None of the colors were distress. All of them were things the team had names for now: the amber of honesty, the gold of warmth, the pale light that was her deepest state, and one other, the color they had labeled A7, the one that had resisted every clean definition until the team settled on the quality of caring for something younger than yourself and finding in its future your own best meaning. "Thank you," she said, "for being the ones I remembered." The process when it came was quiet. There was no violence in it. No struggle. Her biology had clearly evolved for this in the way that some organisms have evolved beautiful, orderly deaths. The ship responded to it as well, its systems cycling down in a coordinated sequence that was clearly designed, clearly prepared for, clearly the completion of something rather than the interruption. The crystal structure of the suspension chamber, the same one she had emerged from on that first day 9 years before, slowly reformed around her. Not imprisoning her. Receiving her. It was the same material, the same warmth, the same faint translucence. The ship, which had brightened when they came aboard all those years ago, gradually lowered its light as she settled, the way a room quiets when a child falls asleep. At the end there was a moment. Okafor noted it, Park noted it, Romanoff later noted it in a rare public statement, when the color of her skin was pure white light. Not fading. Luminous. Then it was gone. The chamber closed. The ship was quiet. The bioluminescent panels in the corridors remained lit at a low, steady amber, the off-hours setting warm and constant. Callum Reed uncrossed his arms. His jaw was still set. His eyes were wet. Park was the first to speak. Not words. Just his name, Idris. Okafor sat for a while longer. Not for any ceremonial reason. Just because he needed to. The room allowed it. The ship allowed it. The ship had always been hospitable, and it was hospitable now, in the way that very old places that have held important things are hospitable, full and quiet and safe for human grief. When he stood slowly. He put one hand on the surface of the crystal for a moment, the same gesture Commander Okafor had made on the outer hull of the ship, 9 years earlier, when the ship had hummed beneath his palm like a sleeping animal recognizing a familiar scent. The crystal was warm. It hummed. He stood there for a long time. The ship remained at L4. The decision to leave it there was not a difficult one. There was no question of moving it and no one suggested it. It had been there for 10 million years. It would remain. But it was not empty. The research station expanded. The mission became permanent. Aelitha's records were transferred to a dedicated facility, and the process of studying them became a field unto itself. The longest continuous research project in human history, it would eventually be called, and one of the most generative. The letters kept coming. Not addressed to her now, or not only. People wrote to the mission, to the researchers, to Okafor, to the record. They wrote about what the story meant to them. They wrote about their own losses and their own long waitings and the things they were trying to build that they would not live to see completed. Marcus Okafor was 11 years old when he visited the ship for the first time since Aelitha's death. He went with his father. He stood in the main chamber and looked at the crystal, which was unchanged, warm, faintly luminous, permanent. "Do you remember her?" his father asked. "Yes," Marcus said. He was quiet for a moment. "She told me about her people. Not the record's version. The real version." Okafor looked at his son. "When did she do that?" "When you were busy once. She said she wanted someone young to carry it. Said young people carry things differently than old people. Lighter. She said that was important." He was quiet again, the specific quiet of a child who is thinking about something large. "She wasn't afraid," Marcus said finally. "Was she?" "No," Okafor said. "She told me herself." "Good." His son looked at the crystal one more time, and then at the amber-lit corridor, and then at the stars outside the observation port. He had his father's eyes. He had something else too, something that Aelith had seen coming from a very long distance away, watching through orbital sensors while a species learned to grieve and sing and build things intended to outlast them. "We should go," Marcus said. "I have homework." Okafor laughed. A real laugh, the first real laugh in the room in a long time. The ship's lights briefly went warm gold. Then they settled back to amber, steady and constant, the way they would remain. A landmark, not an anchor. Something to navigate by. Something to remember. The universe does not produce consciousness accidentally. It produces it the way a river produces the sea, through accumulation, over time, toward something it cannot fully predict but has always been moving toward. Eil Vethorin, from the Public Archive, Year 7 of Contact.